And in Canada's most populous province, bankruptcies are up. So specifically in Ontario, the type of insolvency where people are having to forfeit sometimes their priciest assets, full-on bankruptcy, where they can't really commit to repaying any significant portion of their debts.
If you're watching this, you're probably dealing with serious debt problems. First, know that you're not alone. Thousands of Ontarians face similar challenges every year.
Canada could be facing a serious economic problem as Ontario is in bankruptcy risk. The country's largest provincial economy is heading toward a $13.8 billion deficit, with net debt approaching $485 billion, while manufacturing jobs and investment remain under pressure. Ontario has not literally gone bankrupt, but its financial position is deteriorating fast enough to put Mark Carney and Ottawa in an increasingly difficult position.
Cost of living and affordability struggles. Back then, it was a little bit noticeable. Now it's almost impossible not to notice.
Plus, the war on Iran, the chokehold on oil, driving gas prices up. That, too, is a pain point.
The latest Ontario budget shows how quickly the fiscal picture has deteriorated. The province expects a $12.3 billion deficit for 2025-26, followed by $13.8 billion the next year and another $6.1 billion in 2027-28. The government says it can eventually return to a small surplus, but that recovery depends on economic growth improving over the next several years. Ontario therefore enters a difficult period, carrying large deficits while depending on an economy that is currently expanding at a very modest pace.
Inflation has soared higher than any of us would like.
Groceries are getting more expensive more quickly than many other items.
The debt behind those deficits is even more significant. Ontario projects net debt of about $485.1 billion in 2026-27, with the debt to GDP ratio reaching 37.7%. The ratio is expected to rise again to 38.5% the following year. Ontario can still borrow normally and remains far from a literal insolvency event, but every additional deficit adds another layer to an already enormous debt burden. The province has less room for mistakes if economic conditions become worse than the government currently expects.
U.S. tariffs were introduced. Ontario's in for deeper deficits for longer, even though tariffs didn't squeeze the province's economy as much as feared.
Then there was the cost of carrying that debt. Ontario expects to spend approximately $17.2 billion on interest and other debt servicing charges in 2026-27. That bill is projected to increase to $18.6 billion the following year and $19.7 billion by 2028-29. Those are billions that cannot be spent twice. Every dollar required to service existing obligations is money unavailable for hospitals, transportation, education, tax relief, or other priorities unless the government raises more revenue or borrows additional money.
Our plan is cautious where it must be and ambitious where it should be.
The government projects a deficit of almost $14 billion this year, significantly more than the $8 billion predicted in Budget 2025. Next year, a $6 billion deficit, with a return to surplus in 2028-29, a year later than previously planned.
Ontario also expects to remain a massive borrower. The province must continue moving tens of billions of dollars through debt markets while funding infrastructure and covering fiscal shortfalls. Borrowing itself is normal for a government of Ontario's size, particularly when major infrastructure projects are involved. The concern is the combination of persistent deficits, rising interest costs, and slow economic growth. If those three conditions continue together, balancing the budget becomes considerably harder than the headline projections coming from Queen's Park suggest.
Of course, I'd prefer to have a smaller deficit. I'd prefer to balance sooner. But we have to live in the world we're in.
A world Bethlyn Falvey says still has a lot of challenges. Ontario will spend $244 billion this year. $101 billion of that goes to health, $42 to other programs, and almost $41 billion to education.
The economic forecast explains why this matters now. Ontario expects real GDP to grow only 1% in 2026. Employment growth is projected at just 0.5%, while the unemployment rate is forecast around 7.4%. Growth is expected to improve later, but the immediate environment remains soft. A province carrying hundreds of billions in debt benefits enormously from strong economic expansion because rising incomes and business activities support government revenue. Slow growth gives the government much less help.
More Canadians are so deep in debt, they need to file for insolvency, telling the government, I can't pay all of this off. And it's more Canadians doing this than we've seen in the last 15 plus years.
Ontario's own budget acknowledges the uncertainty surrounding these projections. Trade conflicts are affecting investment and hiring, while businesses remain unsure about future access to the American market. The province's manufacturing economy is particularly exposed because many Ontario factories were built around integrated North American supply chains. Cars, components, steel, and other goods can cross the border multiple times during production. When tariffs or political uncertainty interfere with that system, investment decisions that once looked obvious become much harder for companies to justify.
Canadians are drowning in debt.
Housing and food are expensive.
Coffee, beef, everything's on the rise.
I only shop at Dollarama now.
Everything costs more. How do you bridge that gap? Well, you do it with debt.
The auto industry shows exactly what is at stake. Stellantis is considering options involving its Brampton assembly plant, where roughly 2,200 people worked before the facility closed for retooling. Production for the Jeep Compass that had been expected there was shifted to Illinois after the trade dispute intensified. Unifor now says Stellantis is considering a potential sale of the Brampton facility. There has been no formal closure announcement, but the possibility illustrates how vulnerable Ontario's manufacturing base has become.
People talk about declaring bankruptcy in Canada. There are actually two kinds of bankruptcy you can declare. There's really bankrupt, and then there's kind of bankrupt, but not really.
Brampton matters far beyond the workers who would enter the assembly plant every morning. Large auto factories support parts suppliers, trucking companies, equipment businesses, restaurants, and thousands of indirect jobs. When production disappears, those businesses lose orders as well. A factory sitting idle also means less local spending and weaker tax revenue. Ontario therefore cannot separate its fiscal problem from its industrial problem. The government needs economic growth to stabilize its finances, while some of the industries capable of producing that growth face serious uncertainty. General Motors has created similar anxiety in Ontario. Oshawa has experienced shift reductions, while GM ended BrightDrop electric van production at its Cami facility in Ingersoll after demand failed to develop as expected. Not every plant decision can be blamed on Ottawa or Washington, and BrightDrop had a genuine demand problem. Still, these decisions collectively matter because Ontario needs major manufacturers to keep investing in the province. Losing production today can influence where suppliers, skilled workers, and future investments go tomorrow.
According to the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy, more than 37,000 Canadians either filed a consumer proposal or declared bankruptcy during the first 3 months of this year. That's an increase of 8.5% over the same period in 2025.
This is where Mark Carney becomes part of the story. Ontario controls its own budget, and Doug Ford's government is responsible for provincial spending and borrowing decisions. Ottawa, however, controls major parts of Canada's international trade relationship. Ontario's manufacturing model depends heavily on access to the United States, so federal negotiations can directly affect whether a company considers Ontario competitive. Carney cannot write Ontario's budget, but his government can influence the economic environment in which Ontario is trying to repair its finances.
In the rest of Canada, because we are the engine of the economy.
Licensed insolvency trustee Doug Hoyce says tariffs have been detrimental to Ontario and says increasing unemployment remains a concern.
I suspect that we will see a continued, perhaps gradual, but certainly increase in the number of personal insolvencies filed in Ontario.
Canada and the United States are again dealing with trade negotiations, while tariffs continue disrupting major industries. For Ontario, this is not an abstract diplomatic dispute. American market access can determine whether the next vehicle platform is assigned to an Ontario plant or an American one. A company deciding where to invest billions will compare costs, market access, government incentives, and political risk. If producing inside the United States becomes easier and more predictable, Ontario has to offer a compelling reason for that investment to remain north of the border.
I'm not surprised by these numbers. We know that about half of Canadian households are living paycheck to paycheck, which means, they have no savings.
The Canadian Association of Insolvency and Restructuring Professionals says Canadians are carrying record amounts of debt.
That creates an uncomfortable problem for Carney. His government needs to defend Canadian interests without allowing a prolonged trade confrontation to hollow out Ontario's industrial base. Political toughness means very little to an assembly worker if the production line eventually moves south. Ottawa needs results that preserve market access while giving companies enough certainty to make long-term investments in Canada. If factories continue reducing shifts, delaying projects, or considering exits, Canadians will naturally question whether the federal strategy is actually protecting the economy. Doug Ford cannot place every problem at Ottawa's feet either. Ontario entered this period with a huge debt burden and major spending commitments of its own. The province expects program spending of roughly $227 billion in 2026-27, including more than $101 billion for health. Those services are expensive because Ontario is a large province, but the numbers demonstrate why sustained economic growth matters. When spending remains high and revenues fail to keep pace, deficits become the bridge between political promises and financial reality.
Declaring bankruptcy in Ontario and what you need to know. Bankruptcy is a legal process designed to help individuals who cannot repay their debts. It provides a fresh financial start by eliminating most unsecured debts like credit cards, payday loans, lines of credit, and even tax debts and certain student loans.
Ontario government argues that its fiscal plan remains manageable and points towards a return to balance. The budget projects the deficit falling to $6.1 billion in 2027-28 before a $600 million surplus in 2028-29. That is possible if the economy performs close to the expectations and spendings remain controlled. The risk is that the economic forecasts are forecasts, not guarantees. Another major trade shock, recession, or manufacturing contraction could reduce revenue while simultaneously increasing demand for government support, pushing the path to balance further away. Interest costs make that vulnerability more important. By 2028-29, Ontario expects debt servicing charges to consume about 7.1% of provincial revenue. That does not mean a debt crisis is inevitable, but it means future governments have less flexibility. Higher borrowing costs, less deficits, or weaker revenue can quickly increase the amount going toward interest. Ontario has reduced some refinancing risk by issuing long-term debt. Yet the underlying reality remains that servicing hundreds of billions of dollars becomes more expensive as the debt stock grows.
There are two types of insolvency proceedings for individuals in Canada. One is the consumer proposal, and the other is bankruptcy.
So the headlines I was showing you earlier, they were all about consumer or personal insolvency filings. That's when people like you and me run out of money and can't pay our debts. And the two main types, actual bankruptcy, where you have your debt wiped clean, but you have to sell a bunch of your stuff, do financial counseling, and wreck your credit score for 7 years or so.
The national implications are why Carney cannot watch from the sidelines. Ontario is Canada's largest provincial economy, and it sits at the center of manufacturing, finance, technology, and services. A prolonged Ontario slowdown would affect federal tax revenue, national employment, and businesses operating across provincial borders. Suppliers in other provinces depend on Ontario customers, while transportation networks connect Ontario production with the rest of Canada and the United States. When Ontario struggles, the damage does not remain neatly contained inside provincial boundaries. There is also a confidence problem. Businesses deciding where to build factories look years ahead. They care about taxes, energy, labor, regulations, infrastructure, and access to customers. Persistent trade uncertainty adds another variable to that calculation. Ontario can offer subsidies and Ottawa can announce industrial strategies, but companies ultimately need confidence that products made in Canada can reach their largest markets competitively. Without that certainty, governments risk spending public money simply to convince companies not to leave rather than attracting investment because Ontario is naturally competitive.
Each month of your bankruptcy, you'll make a payment based on your income. Government rules say that the more you make, the more you have to pay in your bankruptcy.
That is why describing Ontario as already bankrupt goes too far, but dismissing the warning signs would be equally misleading. The province remains capable of borrowing, collecting taxes, and financing public services. Its economy is enormous, and the government expects growth to strengthen after 2026. Yet a $13.8 billion deficit, approximately $485 billion in net debt, rising interest costs, and pressure on manufacturing form a combination that deserves attention. Ontario has resources to respond, but those resources are not unlimited. The next few years will show whether Ontario's projected return to balance is realistic or whether the province is entering a much longer period of deficits. If growth strengthens, trade tensions ease, and manufacturing investment returns, the debt burden becomes easier to manage. If those assumptions fail, Ontario could find itself borrowing more while paying increasingly large sums simply to service existing debt. That would leave future governments with harder choices involving spending, taxation, public services, and the investments needed to keep the provincial economy competitive.
Many mortgages will come due this year at higher interest rates. Rising food and gas prices, along with other factors, are pushing some households to the brink. In about 80% of cases, clients choose a consumer proposal instead of bankruptcy, which allows them to have a fixed monthly payment and stops interest from accumulating.
Ontario's situation also exposes the weakness of relying on optimistic future growth to solve problems accumulating today. The province expects real GDP growth to accelerate to 1% this year, to 1.7% in 2027, 1.8% in 2028, and 2% in 2029. Those improvements would certainly help. However, they arrive while Ontario remains exposed to trade disputes, slower hiring, and uncertainty around major manufacturers. A fiscal recovery built around stronger future growth becomes vulnerable when those assumptions are delayed. The government does have arguments in its favor. Ontario performed better than expected in 2025 with an estimated real GDP growth of 1.2% compared with the 0.8% forecast in the previous budget. The province is also making major infrastructure and energy investments intended to support future growth. That means Ontario is not simply sitting still while debt rises. The problem is that investment has to translate into enough economic activity and government revenue to offset the growing cost of programs, borrowing, and interest.
Most of the time, they will pay less than what they owe. It's based on their budget and capacity to pay. And you keep your assets in a proposal. In a bankruptcy, you may lose assets.
Almost 14,000 people in Ontario filed consumer proposals and bankruptcy so far this year. That's almost a 15% increase over the year before.
The rate of increase in insolvencies is a lot worse in Ontario than it is in the rest of Canada.
Carney faces the same test at the federal level. Protecting Ontario cannot mean writing endless subsidy checks whenever another manufacturer threatens to reduce production. Canada needs a trade environment where companies choose Ontario because producing there remains economically attractive. That requires reliable American market access, competitive energy, skilled labor, infrastructure, and enough policy stability for executives to make decisions stretching decades into the future. Every major plant that becomes uncertain makes that challenge harder and increases pressure on Ottawa to produce something more durable than another temporary rescue package. Canada's largest provincial economy is not bankrupt today. The real question is whether its governments recognize the warning before the situation becomes far more difficult to reverse. A $13.8 billion deficit can be repaired. A $485 billion net debt burden can be managed. A manufacturing sector under pressure can recover, but doing all three at the same time requires growth, discipline, investment, and stable trade. If Ford and Carney fail to deliver those conditions, Ontario's current fiscal warning could become Canada's much larger economic crisis.